Fake news. Fake news is what I want to talk to you about today. And right now, I wish I could give you some fake news because it would be easier just to kind of wing it rather than memorize a bunch of important statistics and information. I want to talk about fake news in a different kind of way. I'm just concerned there's a growing perception that more and more of the news is being faked. And I think this is leading to degradation of trust in not only the news, but in other traditional sources of authority. And I know that many of you know that I'm a comic, that I'm a comedic podcast host, but I'm not going to be selling punchlines today. I'm going to be selling concern. Because I'm concerned that if we stop trusting experts, that's not good for the future of our society. Because then who is left to trust? By definition, people who are not experts. And when has trusting people who are not qualified to lead ever done anything good for anyone? Please don't read into this. This is not a political speech. But it does just, it concerns me. It just concerns me that, if you stop choosing to trust the people who are experts, stop choosing to trust the media, maybe because, it's negative news. And I do think there is a lot of negative news. I think there's too much negative news. And I think sometimes the negative news can be so negative, it can seem fake because it's an inaccurate depiction of the world we live in. And that I think so much negative news is now leading to people losing faith in not just the news, but in the education system, in the scientific community, in the medical establishment, and more. So why is the news so largely negative? I don't know. Thank you guys for your time. No. That would be the shortest, worst TED Talk ever. Now, why is the news so largely negative? In a word, money. Money makes our definitely not flat world go round, right? I mean, there was a paper in Russia, 2014, the City Reporter, that decided to do a little social experiment. They decided to run only positive stories for an entire day. And when they did that, readership plummeted by 2/3. They went back to negative stories the next day, so they didn't go out of business. There's an old saying in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. Tragedy sells. Tragedy consistently has sold more newspapers, pushed more YouTube views, pushed more website clicks than positive feel-good stories. And this is true for podcasts as well. Podcasts get downloaded more if they tend to be negative. I have firsthand knowledge of this. I've hosted a podcast called Time Suck for a few years now, where we do listener-suggested, subjects, and they can be about just about anything. It can be, anything interesting. We've done historical events. We've done historical people, crypto, zoology, paranormal, true crime, so many different things. The most downloaded episode we've ever done in over 100 episodes, a Russian serial killer named Andrei Chikatilo. Right? Yes, 3 of the top 5 of the most downloaded episodes are serial killers. The other 2, paranormal horror stories. So all 5 of the top most downloaded episodes are essentially fear-based. Essentially, in a way, negative news. The least downloaded episode, by far actually, Eleanor Roosevelt. Positive news. Eleanor was an important historical figure, but she didn't kill anybody. She didn't scare anybody outside of maybe FDR. She was a formidable person. In 2014, an online study was done. It found that people clicked on negative headlines 63% more often than they did on positive headlines. And this made me wonder, was there ever a time when the news was largely positive or at least neutral? Yes, there was. Back when no one made any money in the news. The first incident of publishing that we know of occurred in 868 CE. A man named Wang Ji in China published the Diamond Sutra, Key Theological Elements of Buddhism, on a block printer, and based on the explosion of printing that did not follow in 9th century China, we can assume largely that nobody really cared. Several hundred years later, the now famous Gutenberg Bible was published in present-day Germany in either 1454 or 1455. In 1456, the publisher, Johannes Gutenberg, went bankrupt. In the 1780s, that's when publishing really got going in America. The early papers, the first papers, they didn't really editorialize. They just published the facts, talked about local and world events, talked about politics and finance, and it was just, pretty dry. It was, this treaty was signed by this guy wearing a wig on this day. This ship went there. Farmer John is auctioning his cattle at the courthouse on Tuesday. And most of these early papers hemorrhaged money. It didn't sell. Papers didn't really start to sell until the late 1820s, early 1830s. That was the penny press. Journals started being published. Early versions of today's tabloids. Newspaper publishers realized there was a sizable working class that couldn't afford the going rate of 6 cents an issue, but they could afford a penny. And they also realized that this new audience didn't necessarily care what was going on in the stock market. They didn't care what Farmer John was up to. But based on early sales, they did care about gossip and crime. Penny press journalists were the first to really report on crime. They were the first to investigate corruption in both industry and politics, and they editorialized heavily. And it worked. They made money. If it bleeds, it leads. Right? And it changed journalism forever. Why do we have so much negative news? It's because it's what we choose to consume. We choose to buy it over and over. Maybe we should look at ourselves more than the press. You know, they're going to keep selling it if we keep buying it. And they do keep selling it. Little has changed in the way journalism has been done since the advent of those penny press journalists. You know, I mean, what has changed is the amount of negative news. We're bombarded now. We're inundated with negative news all the time. You know, I have a news feed on my phone, like pretty much everybody now that I check. I don't even want to know how often I check it. 40 times, 50 times a day. I know I check it so often that it's become a huge pet peeve with my wife. I check it in the middle of dinner. You know, I check it during family activities. I just need to know what's going on now with the news. And there's so much news. There's over 300 different 24-hour news stations around the world. There's roughly 20 different 24-hour satellite news channels, hundreds of news and news-related podcasts, countless YouTubers, social media influencers, bloggers, and more pushing out the news. And with an increase in options comes an increase in competition. And with more competition comes more incentive to sensationalize, and sometimes fake the news. In the last few decades, the news has been so often just spun, slanted, sensationalized, sometimes outright faked, that a frightening new trend is developing. People are starting to lose faith in not just the news, but in all traditional forms of authority. And this isn't just my opinion. There's numbers and stats I've been killing myself trying to memorize to back up this information. According to annual Gallup polling, back in 1979, 51% of Americans placed a great deal of faith in newspapers. That number is down to 23% now. Back in 1975, 62% of Americans placed a great deal of faith in the educational system. That number is down to 29% now. Back in 1975, 80% of the American public trusted the medical establishment a great deal. That number is down to 36% now. Our faith in our usually reliable sources of information is plummeting. It's dropped by over 50% in the past 4 decades. I started to think, why? Why is this happening? I blame largely negative news. I think that fear sells in the short term, but I think it fails long term, because if you keep overselling fear time and time again, you lose credibility. It's the classic boy who cried wolf. Stop telling us the sky is falling. It's not true. Stop pushing fear on us all the time. You know, there's all these stories constantly about shootings and terrorism and murder and kidnappings, but the truth is, it's not going to happen to most of us. Most of our lives are not going to be affected by terrorism. Most of us are not going to be killed by a serial killer. We're not going to have our children kidnapped. We're actually not going to die of cancer. How about that news? That would be nice. Something a little more positive. You know, serial killers especially become very popular just in the media recently. And I think if you listen to enough of that, it just makes you think, man, there just must be serial killers just everywhere. They're just all around us all the time. But actually, there's 75% less serial killers now than there was just a few decades ago. Right? Isn't that surprising? I worry about child predators. I'm a parent. I have 2 kids. You hear so many stories about child predators. I'm truly nervous to let my kids just ride around the block unsupervised. I often think, like, man, I wish things were like they were when I was a kid, back in the 80s when the world was so much safer. And I used to ride my bike around the block all the time unsupervised. Well, it turns out that my parents should have been a lot more worried about me. there's actually less than 60%, there's 60% less reported incidents of sexual abuse now than there was when I was a kid. Right? It's actually much safer now. And I do need to talk to my parents about this. It's like they wanted something to happen. Violent crime in general is actually plummeting. Based on Bureau of Justice statistics, this stat blew my mind. There is 75% less violent crime now than there was in the early 90s. The world is actually a lot safer, but we keep hearing that it's so dangerous. And I think it's easy when you keep hearing this to want to stop trusting the news, to feel like you're constantly being manipulated. So should we stop trusting the news? No. I actually don't think we should. I don't think you should throw the baby of expertise out with the bathwater of fake news. There is still a lot of, real news being reported. And I think we still should trust experts to a certain degree, right? Because if you don't, again, like I said earlier, who are you left to trust? By default, the non-experts. Now you're relying on people held to lower standards, held to less scrutiny than the people you were avoiding because you feel like they're manipulating you. And now you're putting yourself in a position where you can be manipulated to an even greater degree. Think about it this way. Let's say you had to get some work done in your house. You had to get some important work done. You had to get your roof repaired. And if you don't get it repaired, it could cave in the middle of the night and kill your entire family in their sleep. Pretty important job. Who are you going to hire for this important job? Are you going to hire a licensed contractor? Are you going to find somebody with a resume and references, somebody who had to get accredited, somebody who had to learn a trade? Or are you just going to walk into your local neighborhood bar and just hire the first person who raises their hand when you ask, does anyone here know what a hammer is and think they can fix my roof? I hope you would hire the experts. I hope you value expertise and understand that that guy is probably going to keep your family safer than the random dude who just thinks he can do the job. Experts do matter. Experts sustain our culture, they advance our culture. It's a very, very important job. We shouldn't just lose faith entirely in experts. I think about it this way. There's a quote from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the literary mind behind Sherlock Holmes. He said, "Healthy skepticism is the basis of all accurate information." I think that's a very important quote, and I think that's how we should approach the media. Don't just trust implicitly, but also don't commit the logical fallacy of thinking that because sometimes the media has lied, that because maybe it's over-sensationalized, we should just stop trusting them altogether and they must all be liars all of the time. Use some healthy skepticism. When a story is important to you, look into numerous sources. Fact check one source against another. Look into the liberal side, look into the conservative side, and realize that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. What do both sides agree on? Use those critical thinking skills. Take responsibility for the information you choose to consume and repeat. I think about that a lot. I think about we're worrying about people broadcasting fake news. What about ourselves? Are you broadcasting fake news? Do you actually think about what you're saying? Do you actually fact check the information that just pours freely from your pie hole? I wonder that all the time in conversations. This person seems very sure of themselves. I don't think they know what they're talking about. Are you finding sources? Are you fact-checking those sources? Or are you just repeating some half-cocked nonsense you read on Facebook? I think we should approach the media this way, give them the benefit of the doubt. In some cases, I think we should approach all authority figures in this way, with teachers, rather than just lose faith in the entire educational system because maybe you proved a teacher wrong a few times. Why not step back and think, but what about all the other times they were right? They did study this after all. Just like the contractor is probably going to keep your house safer than that random dude in the bar with a hammer, a doctor who had to go to medical school is probably going to keep you a lot healthier than your friend who doesn't trust the medical establishment, watches a lot of YouTube videos, and strongly believes in the healing power of crystals. Maybe you shouldn't trust that guy. I think all of this is so important to think about. I think with the media too, I think maybe be a little bit less sensational. Hold yourself to a higher standard than just being clickbait. Report some Eleanor Roosevelt stories a little more often with your doom and gloom. Some good news came with that Eleanor Roosevelt episode. It didn't get the downloads that a lot of the other episodes get, but it did get a lot more emails. Over the next few weeks, I had a lot of people write in and say that at first they were kind of bummed that she showed up in the feed. They thought it was going to be boring. But then when they reluctantly took a chance and listened, they were pleasantly surprised. They found her story very interesting and inspiring, and they thanked me for telling it, and then they told me that they would be open to more stories like hers in the future. What if the media in general did that? What if the media took more chances on positive stories? What if we could get to a place where it doesn't have to bleed to lead? I think that would make the world a lot nicer place. I think maybe we'd have more faith in the media and then more faith in experts in general. I mean, how nice would that be? You know, because the truth is, despite all the negative, sometimes fake news that you hear, the world is actually the best it has ever been right now. And I think if we keep trusting experts to some degree, hopefully it can stay that way or get even better. And that is not fake news. Thank you guys for your time.